She had learned, in her 3 years of working the night shift in the palace, that the west corridor after midnight belonged to ghosts and silence. Not real ghosts. Elena did not believe in those, but the kind of silence that had weight to it, the kind that pressed against the eardrums and made every footstep feel like a confession. She had learned to move quietly through it, learned to carry her cleaning cloth and her bucket without letting metal touch stone, learned to breathe in shallow pulls so the sound of her own lungs would not disturb the dark. What she had not learned, in 3 years of this careful, practiced invisibility, was how to notice a glass that did not belong. It sat on the edge of the long table in the outer anteroom of the king's private wing, a single crystal glass, half filled with something dark. Not wine. The color was too deep for wine, too still. It caught the single candle flame from the wall sconce and held it without moving, the way old blood holds light in paintings nobody looks at twice. Elena assumed a servant had forgotten it. This happened. The younger girls grew frightened near the king's quarters and moved quickly, leaving things behind. She had retrieved dozens of forgotten items over the years, a candlestick, a folded cloth. Once, memorably, an entire tray of untouched food that she had quietly distributed to the kitchen workers before dawn. The glass was different, only in that it was beautiful, hand-blown, etched with a pattern along the rim that looked like vines or veins, depending on how the light hit it. Elena was not a woman who coveted things. 3 years of palace service had taught her the particular exhaustion of wanting what you could not have. But she paused, cloth in hand, and looked at it longer than she should have. Her throat was dry. She had not eaten since the afternoon. The walk from the servants' quarters to the west wing at this hour took longer than anyone accounted for, and nobody thought to leave water for the night staff. Nobody thought about the night staff at all, which was, Elena had always understood, precisely the point. She reached for the glass to move it to the tray she was carrying. Her fingers touched the stem, and then she made the mistake. Later, she would not be able to explain it cleanly, even to herself. The dryness of her throat. The beauty of the glass. The way the liquid inside smelled faintly of something dark and sweet that she could not name. Something that made the back of her mouth ache in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. Whatever the reason, her lips touched the rim before her mind caught up with her body. A single swallow. Cold going down, then immediately warm, spreading from her chest outward like spilled ink through water. Elena set the glass down. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. She stood very still in the candlelit anteroom and waited to understand what she had just done. The warmth kept spreading. It moved up her throat, behind her eyes. Her vision did not blur exactly. If anything, it sharpened. The stone wall across from her became more stone than it had been a moment ago, every variation in color suddenly legible. The single candle flame divided itself in her perception into a dozen separate movements. She could smell the wax burning, yes, but also the stone, and the old wood of the table, and something underneath all of it, something that had no name in any language Elena had ever learned. It was like standing very close to a thunderstorm, the pressure of something enormous, waiting. She was still standing there, hand against her mouth, when the door at the far end of the anteroom opened without a sound. He did not announce himself. He never did, she had heard. The king of Varenthal moved through his own palace the way winter moved through an unshuttered window, without asking, without warning, simply present where he had not been a moment before. Kalen Voss was not what the stories made him. The stories made him enormous, monstrous, a thing of claw and hunger, barely contained in the shape of a man. Elena had glimpsed him twice in 3 years, both times at a distance, both times from the kind of shadow a night shift servant learns to stand in. He was tall, yes, dark-haired, yes. But the monstrous part, she had never seen it. What she had seen, both times, from her careful distance, was something closer to exhaustion. The particular kind that did not come from lack of sleep, but from carrying something heavy, for so long, that the weight had become invisible to everyone, except the person bearing it. He crossed the room toward the table. His eyes found the glass immediately. Then they found her. Elena did not run. She had learned, in 3 years, that running in the palace rarely helped and frequently made things worse. She stood very still, cloth still in her hand, and met his gaze with the specific combination of steadiness and deference that had kept her employed through 4 head stewards and 2 regime changes in the serving staff. Kalen Voss looked at her face. Something moved behind his eyes, something that had no name in the languages she knew, something old and very focused. He crossed the remaining distance between them in 3 steps, stopped close enough that she could feel the cold that came off him, not the cold of illness, but the cold of something that ran at a different temperature than living things. His eyes moved across her face slowly, the way a person reads something they have been waiting a very long time to find. His voice, when it came, was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was the kind of quiet that had been practiced for centuries until it could carry across a room without effort. Finally, just that word. One word, spoken like the ending of something. Elena had no answer for it. She stood in the candlelight in the king's anteroom with his blood, and she understood now, with cold clarity, that it had been blood, moving warm through her chest, and she had no answer for what he had said, or the way he was looking at her, like she was something he had been looking for in every room he had ever walked through. She opened her mouth. He raised one hand, a small gesture, almost gentle. "Don't apologize," Kalen said quietly. "Not yet." Nobody came to find her. This was the first thing Elena understood, standing in the anteroom while the candle guttered, and the king watched her with that focused, ancient stillness. In 3 years of palace service, she had learned the specific rhythms of consequence. Broken glass meant a summons to the head steward within the hour. A misspoken word to a noble meant a formal reprimand by morning. Taking something that did not belong to you, even accidentally, even something as small as one swallow from a forgotten glass, should have produced immediate, visible punishment. Instead, Kalen Voss stood 2 feet away from her and said nothing else. He only looked. The warmth in Elena's chest had not faded. If anything, it had deepened, settling into her bones the way heat settles into stone that has been sitting in sunlight all afternoon. She was aware of things she should not have been aware of. The sound of his breathing, slower than a living man's, slower even than sleep. The precise distance between them, measured not in feet, but in something that had no unit. The fact that his eyes, which she had always heard described as black, were not black at all but a very dark gray, the color of the sky in the last moment before dawn decided to happen. "You're not afraid," Kalen said. He did not say it like an accusation. He said it like a man reading aloud something written in a language he had almost given up on finding. Elena considered this. "I'm thinking about whether I should be." Something shifted in his face. Not a smile, not quite. The movement was smaller than a smile, confined to the corners of his eyes, and it was gone before she could be certain she had seen it at all. "That's honest." He turned away from her, moving toward the window that overlooked the inner courtyard, his hands clasped behind his back, the posture of someone who had stood in front of windows for a very long time, thinking thoughts that went nowhere. "How do you feel?" "Warm." Elena said it before she could decide whether honesty was wise. "Everything is clearer. The light looks different." "That will pass." What was in the glass? A long pause. The courtyard below was dark, the fountain in its center a black shape against gray stone. "Something that wasn't meant for you," Kalen said. "I gathered that." Elena set her cleaning cloth on the tray with deliberate care. "I assumed it was wine. The younger girls sometimes leave things. I was going to move it. And instead, you drank it." "My throat was dry." She paused. "I understand if that's not a sufficient explanation." He turned from the window to look at her again. That same focused quality, that same sense of reading something sentence by sentence, not wanting to miss a word. "How long have you worked in this wing?" 3 years. Night shift. Always. "I've seen you," he said, "in the corridor. You move quietly." Elena had no response to this. The idea that he had noticed her, that he had filed away her existence, the sound of her footsteps, the particular way she moved through his corridor, sat strangely in her chest alongside the warmth. Not frightening, strange. "You should sit down," Kalen said. "I'm fine standing. You drank something that was not made for human physiology. You may feel fine now." His voice remained level. "Sit down." She sat, because arguing with vampire kings at midnight about whether her physiology could handle their blood was not a battle she had the energy for. The chair nearest the table was wooden and old and solid beneath her, and she was grateful, suddenly, for its solidity. Kalen remained standing. He had a physician's way of observing her from across the room, cataloging information without appearing to. His eyes moved across her face, her hands, the pulse at her throat. "Tell me your name," he said. Elena Voss." She stopped. Color rose in her face. "Marsden. Elena Marsden." The ghost of that almost expression again. "You share my name." A coincidence? Probably. He moved to the chair on the opposite side of the table, not close, maintaining a distance that felt deliberate and careful. He sat with the specific stillness of someone who had long ago given up fidgeting as a habit. "The blood in that glass was mine, Elena." She had known, since the swallow settled warm in her chest, and the world grew sharp-edged and strange. But hearing it spoken was different from knowing it. She held the knowledge at arm's length for a moment, examining it. "Why was it there?" "I was testing something." His jaw worked briefly. "A theory." "What kind of theory?" He looked at her steadily. "The kind that has taken me 140 years to get close enough to test. And which you may have just answered, accidentally, by drinking it before I could observe the process properly." Elena thought about this. "You're angry." "No." He said it without hesitation. "I'm not angry." He looked at his hands on the table, the long fingers, the stillness of them. "I am trying to decide how to explain something to a woman who came in here to clean a floor and accidentally stepped into the middle of something she has no context for." "I'm a good listener," Elena said. He raised his eyes to hers. That gray, that pre-dawn gray, settled on her face. "I know," Kalen said quietly. "I've watched you listen to the palace for 3 years. You listen to everything. You hear things other people walk past." He paused. "That's why the glass was on the table." Elena went very still. "You left it there for me." He did not answer immediately. The candle between them burned down another fraction of itself. "I left it there," he said finally, "to see what would happen." The warmth in Elena's chest, which had been settling into something almost comfortable, tightened. Not into fear, into something more complicated. The understanding that she had not stumbled into a mistake, that she had been, without knowing it, a variable in something she had never been asked permission to be part of. She looked at the vampire king across the table. He looked back at her with that ancient, careful attention. "You should have asked me," she said. Kalen Voss held her gaze. "Yes." His voice was quieter than the candle flame. "I should have." He told her to go back to the servants' quarters. He said it with the particular authority of someone who was unaccustomed to requests being questioned, but also with something underneath the authority that sounded almost like concern. The combination was strange enough that Elena obeyed without arguing, which was not usually her nature. She lay on her narrow bed in the room she shared with 2 other night shift maids, and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep. The warmth had faded by the time the first gray light came through the high window. Not completely. There was still something in her chest that felt different from the day before, like a room that has been rearranged so subtly that you cannot name the specific change, only register the wrongness of the new arrangement. But the sharpness had faded. The world looked the way it usually looked. Stone was stone again. Candlelight was candlelight. The palace had resumed its ordinary weight and dimension. What had not resumed its ordinary dimension was the memory of his face. Elena was a practical woman. She had become practical by necessity, in the specific way that people who cannot afford the luxury of feeling things too deeply become practical. Her mother had been practical. Her mother's mother, from what Elena had been told, had been practically practical down to her bones, a woman who had looked at every situation in her life and asked first, not what it meant, but what it required of her. Elena had inherited this. It had served her well. It had gotten her hired at 17, promoted to night shift lead at 19, trusted with the West Corridor, the King's Corridor, by 20. It had never prepared her for a vampire king looking at her like she was the answer to a question he had stopped allowing himself to ask. She reported for her shift the following night as usual. The West Corridor was quiet. The anteroom was empty. The table where the glass had sat held nothing but dust and the memory of candlelight. Elena cleaned methodically, corner to corner, the way she always did, and told herself that what had happened the night before was an anomaly, a mistake, a thing that would not repeat. She was on her knees polishing the baseboard beneath the outer window when she heard the door. Not the anteroom door, the inner door, the one that connected the anteroom to the king's private study. She had never heard it open in 3 years. She had assumed it was always locked. It was not locked tonight. Kalen stood in the doorway, still dressed as she had seen him the night before, dark clothing, no crown, no ceremony. He looked at her on her knees by the baseboard, and something in his expression shifted. Not discomfort, but the awareness of a detail he had not accounted for. He crossed the room and crouched down beside her without comment, his long frame folding itself to her level with the specific unself-consciousness of someone who had, at some point, stopped caring about the indignity of positions. "How do you feel?" he said. Not a question exactly, an inspection. "Fine." Elena sat back on her heels. "Normal." "Any residual effects? Heightened perception, unusual appetite, sensitivity to sound?" "I told you, normal." He was close enough that she could see the detail of his face, the things that distance had obscured in all her years of careful, shadow-dwelling observation, the lines around his eyes that might, on a living man, have indicated age, the set of his jaw, which was not harsh exactly, but held something, restraint, maybe, the practiced quality of a man who had long ago decided that his face would give away nothing that he had not decided to give. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You owe me an apology first." A pause. He looked at her steadily. "Yes, both." He stayed crouched beside her, which Elena found she preferred to him standing over her. It felt, oddly, more honest. "I am sorry, Elena. Genuinely. What I did was not... I had reasons. That doesn't make it right." "What were the reasons?" He was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved to the window, the darkness beyond it. "There is a quality in some humans," Kalen said slowly, "that my kind can sense, but cannot always identify or predict. A compatibility, not with vampires broadly, with specific vampires. Individual. The old scholars called it resonance." He said the word like he was not sure he believed in it, and had been forced to use it anyway, for lack of better vocabulary. "It is extremely rare. I have met perhaps 4 people in my life who possessed it to any degree. The others were unsuitable, for different reasons. None of them survived the test." Elena was quiet for a moment, the test being drinking your blood. A small amount, diluted, left in a place where it might be found. His jaw tightened. "I had done this 7 times over the past 40 years. In each case, the human who drank it experienced immediate severe reaction, pain, fever. In 2 cases, something worse." He paused. "I stopped. For 11 years I stopped entirely. Then I began to notice you." Elena looked at him. "Notice me. The way you move through this corridor. The way you listen. There is a quality in the way you pay attention to things that..." He stopped. "Started again. I should have asked you. I understand that. I have no defense for why I didn't, except that I was afraid of what it would mean if you said no." "And what does it mean?" Elena said. "That I didn't react." Kalen looked at her face for a long moment. His gray eyes, that pre-dawn gray, held something in them that she had no word for, something large and old and very carefully contained. "It means," he said quietly, "that you may be the person I have been looking for since before your grandmother was born." Elena absorbed this. She turned it over, the way she turned over difficult facts in her life, the death of her mother, the necessity of leaving her village, the choice to take a job in a palace, that frightened everyone she knew. She examined it from different angles, looking for the place where it broke down. "That," she said at last, "is a significant thing to say to someone you have never spoken to before last night. I know. You should have led with it differently. I know that too." Elena looked at the window, then at him, at the careful, exhausted face of a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and was not, she suspected, particularly good at putting things down. "Tell me the rest of it," she said. "All of it. What resonance means, what comes after, what you want from me, and what it costs." Kalen held her gaze. Something in his face loosened, barely, in the way a fist loosens. When it has been clenched for so long, the owner has forgotten the loosening is possible. "It will take more than one night," he said. "I work every night," Elena said. "I'm not going anywhere." He began, as people who have carried secrets for a very long time tend to begin, with the history rather than the feeling. The history of resonance, as Kalen explained it over the following hour, seated across from Elena at the old table in the anteroom, while her bucket of cleaning water went cold beside the door, was not well documented. This was not an accident. The vampire scholars who had studied it in the early centuries had been, on the whole, embarrassed by it. Embarrassed by anything that suggested their kind was not entirely self-sufficient, that there might be humans who mattered to specific vampires in ways that defied the clean hierarchy of predator and prey, that made the political structure easier to maintain. What they knew, stripped of the embarrassment, resonance occurred when the blood of a specific vampire recognized the cellular structure of a specific human as compatible in a way that went beyond the ordinary. It was not about strength or weakness. It was not about magical bloodlines or ancient prophecy. It was, as Kalen described it, with the dry precision of a man who had spent a century trying to reduce something inexplicable to something manageable, more like a lock and a key. Neither object knew, in isolation, what it was. Neither functioned differently than any other lock or key, but put them in proximity, and something clicked. "And the clicking," Elena said. "What does that mean, practically?" Kalen's hands lay flat on the table. For the vampire, heightened awareness of the human's presence. With difficulty with distance, a pull toward proximity that becomes uncomfortable to resist over time. Uncomfortable. Painful, he said, more quietly. Over extended periods, yes. Elena looked at his hands on the table. Thought about 3 years, about a man who moved through his own palace with the particular careful isolation of someone who had long ago decided that loneliness was preferable to the specific agony of wanting what he could not allow himself to have. For the human, she said. For the blood, when consumed, acts as a kind of introduction between systems. The human body reads it. If there is resonance, the body accepts it, integrates it, in the old scholarship's language. If there is not, the body rejects it, violently. And I integrated it. Yes. What does that mean for me? Ongoing. Kalen was quiet for a moment. You will be more aware of me than you would otherwise be. You will be able to sense my mood, to some degree, when in proximity. You may find that my presence is not unpleasant. He said this last part carefully, like a man reading a clause from a contract he is not sure the other party has agreed to. In some documented cases, over time, the human's lifespan extended, not to immortality, but beyond its natural limit. Elena absorbed this. You're describing something that changes my life without my consent. The change has already happened, he said. I can't undo it. I can only explain it. She looked at him steadily. Do you want to undo it? The question sat between them. Kalen looked at his hands. No, he said, and then, because she deserved the full honesty of it. I have wanted this, wanted to find this, for a very long time. That does not make what I did acceptable, but I will not lie to you about what I feel. Elena appreciated this. She had no use for comfortable lies. She had spent 3 years in a palace full of them, and had developed an accurate sense for their weight, the specific heaviness of words that were shaped around what people wanted to be true rather than what was. "Tell me about the last 140 years, she said. He looked up. "You said it took you 140 years to get close enough to test the theory," Elena said. "That means something happened 140 years ago. Tell me what." A long silence. The candle between them burned. Somewhere in the palace, a clock struck the second hour of morning. "Her name was Marin," Kalen said at last. He told it the way people tell things they have told themselves too many times, without embellishment, without the softening that comes from having an audience. Just the shape of it, clean and spare, and still heavy despite the sparseness. Marin had been a physician's daughter. She had come to the palace at 22, briefly, as part of a diplomatic envoy from the southern provinces. Kalen had sensed the resonance within hours of her arrival. That click, that specific and unmistakable recognition. He had not known then what it was. He had known only that he could not stop being aware of where she was in any room they shared. He had known that her absence felt like a missing step in a staircase, that physical jolt of expecting solid ground and finding air. He had done nothing. She had been human. She had been a guest. He had been, even then, a man who understood the weight of what he was and tried to carry it without pressing it onto others. Marin had left at the end of the envoy. She had lived a full life, married, had children, died at 63, in a village 3 provinces south. He had not seen her again after the week of the envoy. He had not allowed himself to. After Marin, Kalen said, I began to research, to understand what I had felt. It took decades to find the old scholarship, decades more to understand it well enough to believe it was real and not, he stopped, not something I had invented to explain an inconvenient attachment. And the testing, Elena said gently. 7 years of preparation, 7 humans over 40 years, all of whom showed preliminary signs, none of whom survived the integration. His voice was level. His hands on the table were very still. After the last failure, I stopped. I told myself the scholarship was wrong, or that I had misidentified the signs, or that resonance was a thing that had existed once and no longer did. I believed this for 11 years. And then you noticed me, Elena said. And then I noticed you. The anteroom held them both in its candlelit quiet. Elena looked at the man across the table, the 140 years of careful, deliberate loneliness in the set of his shoulders, the practiced stillness of his hands. You should have told me, she said again, not angry, just true. I was afraid you would say no, Kalen said, and I was afraid of what I would do if you did. What would you have done? He met her eyes. Respected it, he said simply, and gone back to the 11 years. Elena was quiet for a moment. Then she reached across the table and set her hand, briefly, over his. Not a promise, not absolution, just acknowledgement, the specific warmth of one person telling another person that they have been heard. I'm not saying yes to anything yet, she said. I'm saying I'm listening. Kalen looked at her hand, then at her face. That, he said quietly, is more than I expected. The palace had its own ecosystem of information, running through the servants' quarters and the kitchen corridors and the laundry rooms in patterns, as reliable as weather. Elena had learned to read it in her first month. She knew which rumors had substance and which were born of boredom, knew which gossip to carry and which to let pass through her without leaving a mark. She had not anticipated becoming the subject of it. It began subtly, a look from the head steward when she arrived for her shift on the 3rd night, a fractional pause in the kitchen conversation when she entered to collect her bucket, the particular kind of silence that a group of people produces when they have been talking about the person who just walked in and have not yet had time to replace the silence with something else. By the 5th night, it was less subtle. The king asked about you, said Rosie, who worked the East Wing and had the specific social confidence of someone who had survived 4 head stewards by knowing everyone's business before they knew it themselves. She said it while folding linens at the long table in the laundry, not looking at Elena, her hands moving with the practiced speed of someone who did not need to watch what they were doing. Specifically, called the head steward in and asked who worked the West Corridor on night shift and how long she'd been employed. Elena kept her face neutral. When? 2 days ago. Rosie glanced up. You didn't know. I'm finding out now. He never asks about staff, not individually, not by corridor, not by name. Rosie folded a corner with unnecessary precision. Whatever you did, Elena, people are paying attention. What she had done, Elena thought, was drink from a glass she should have left alone. What she had done was sit across a table from a vampire king and ask him to explain himself. What she had done, night after night for the past 2 weeks, was return to the West Corridor and find him already in the anteroom, already waiting, already with the particular quality of presence that she had begun, against all practical wisdom, to look forward to. They talked. This was the thing she had not expected. Not the resonance, not the blood, not any of the old scholarship's language for what existed between specific vampires and specific humans. She had not expected that what they would mostly do, night after night, was talk. He asked her about her village, about the journey to the capital, about her mother's practicality, the specific texture of a life lived in calculated survival. He listened the way very few people had ever listened to her, not waiting for the end of her sentences so he could begin his own, but actually following the thread of what she was saying, asking questions that demonstrated he had been paying attention 3 sentences back. She asked him about the early centuries, about what the world had looked like before the things she took as permanent had existed, about the specific geography of grief, whether it changed over that span of time, whether a person could carry loss for long enough that it became something else, something lighter, or whether it just accumulated. Both, he told her. Different losses become different things. Some lighten, some calcify. He had paused. Marin calcified. But you're talking about her. With you. He had said it simply. I've found I can talk about most things with you that I don't talk about with anyone else. This should have frightened her. Elena had examined it from the practical angle, the angle her mother would have taken. A powerful man developing a specific attachment to her, the asymmetry of their positions, the ways this could go wrong. The list was not short. And yet the fear, which she had fully expected to materialize, kept failing to appear. In its place was something that her mother's vocabulary did not quite have a word for. Not comfort, exactly. Something more like recognition. The sensation of being seen clearly by someone who had decided that what they saw was worth the seeing. On the 14th night, he showed her the library. Not the palace's public library, which Elena had cleaned once and found magnificent in the way that public things are magnificent, designed to impress, curated for a specific effect. His private library, accessible through the inner corridor of his wing, a room she had not known existed, floor to ceiling, 4 walls, a rolling ladder on a track, candles in iron holders that cast moving shadows across spines in a dozen languages. Elena stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, taking it in. You can use it whenever you like, Kalen said behind her. He stood at the door, hands in his pockets, watching her with that quiet attention. The staff doesn't have access to this corridor, so you'd need... He paused. You'd need to come through the anteroom. Through your space. Yes. Elena looked at a shelf of books in a language she didn't recognize. You're giving me a reason to come back. I'm giving you a library, he said. What you do with the reason is your decision. She pulled a book from the shelf. Old binding, pages that smelled of the specific antiquity that only things made by people who were no longer alive could smell of. She opened it to a random page and found illustrations, botanical, detailed, each plant labeled in that unknown language. What language is this? A dialect that hasn't been spoken in about 400 years. I can read it. He moved into the room, crossing to stand beside her, close enough to look at the page she held. That one is a plant that grew in the southern mountain range, used for fever reduction, among other things. It's been extinct for about 2 centuries. Elena studied the illustration. The artist had been precise, loving. each leaf vein rendered with the specific care of someone who understood that this plant mattered. Someone drew this because they wanted to remember it. Yes. That's what books are, Elena said. Someone refusing to let something disappear. The Kaelin looked at her profile. She felt it, the quality of his attention, the way it had weight and texture. She had begun, over the past 2 weeks, to understand what he had meant by the pull toward proximity. She felt it too, though from her side it presented less as pain and more as a specific awareness. The precise location of him in any room she shared with him, the way the air felt different when he was in it. "Elena," he said. She looked up from the book. His face was very close. Close enough that she could see the things that distance always obscured. The faint silver at his temples that she had originally assumed was age, and had since understood was something else. Something to do with the specific century in which his vampiric nature had settled into its permanent form. "I want you to understand something," he said quietly. "Whatever you decide, whatever you choose to do with the information I've given you, with what exists between us, I am not going to push. That is not something I'm willing to do. Because it's wrong," Elena said. "Because it's wrong," he agreed. "And because—" a pause. His jaw worked briefly. "Because what I want, more than anything I have wanted in a very long time, is for you to want to be here. Not because you felt you had no choice. Because you chose it." Elena looked at him for a long moment, at the careful, exhausted face, the gray eyes, the 140 years of practiced restraint in every line of him. She closed the book gently and set it on the table beside them. "I'm here right now," she said. "I'm choosing that." Kaelin held her gaze. Something in his face moved, very quietly, like light on water. "Yes," he said, "you are." There were people, Elena understood, who would not be pleased. She became aware of this gradually, the way you become aware of weather. Not as a single event, but as a cumulative shift in pressure, a series of small signs that add up, eventually, to something you cannot ignore. The looks in the corridor, the particular silence that followed her into the kitchen, Rosie's careful neutrality, which was its own kind of information, coming from a woman who was neutral about nothing. And then, on the 19th night, Lord Aldrich. He was one of the 3 members of the King's Advisory Council who held standing access to the private wing, a privilege that Elena now understood was significant and not casually granted. He was old, not in the way that humans were old, not the softening and slowing of it, but the specific old of something that had been hardening for centuries. His face held the pleasant expression of a man who had long ago decided that pleasantness was a more efficient weapon than its alternatives. He found her in the outer corridor at the start of her shift. His smile was careful and warm and completely empty of anything warm. "The West Corridor girl," he said, as if he did not know her name. He certainly knew her name. He had the kind of eyes that filed everything away and never misplaced a detail. "I wonder if I might have a word." Elena adjusted her bucket. "Of course, my lord." He walked with her toward the anteroom, which meant walking in the direction he had chosen and at the pace he set, a small dominance that she recognized and did not rise to. He spoke pleasantly about the palace, about the history of the West Wing, about the significance of the king's private quarters in the broader context of Varenthal's political architecture. None of this was the word he wanted to have. They reached the anteroom. "You've been spending considerable time here," Lord Aldrich said, still pleasantly, "beyond your cleaning duties." "The king has given me use of his library," Elena said. "I've been taking advantage of it on my off hours." "The king," Lord Aldrich repeated, as if he were tasting something, "has given you a maid on the night staff." He turned to look at her, and the pleasantness stayed in place, but something shifted behind it, something that had been waiting for the moment when pleasantness was no longer efficient. "My dear, I don't imagine you understand the implications of what you're doing." "I'm reading books," Elena said. "You are," he agreed, "attaching yourself to a man who has not made a personal connection in 140 years, and who is, frankly, not in a stable condition to do so. The king's isolation has been difficult for him, difficult for all of us who care about the realm. He is not a person who handles attachment well. He has not had the practice. Elena looked at him steadily. You're concerned about him. I'm concerned about the realm, Lord Aldrich said, which is the same thing, at the level at which I operate. When the king becomes focused on something, he becomes focused on nothing else. A maid who has caught his attention will not remain simply a maid. She will become a distraction, an obsession, potentially. And when that ends, and these things end, my dear, they always end, the consequences for the palace are significant. He paused. For the maid, the consequences are typically more significant still. Elena was quiet for a moment. She thought about what Kaelin had said about Marin, the click, the recognition, the 40 years of trying to find it again in others. She thought about the word calcified. Thank you for your concern, she said. Lord Aldrich looked at her for a moment. His pleasant expression considered her, and behind it, something recalibrated. You're not afraid, he said. I keep being told that, like it's unusual, Elena said. Maybe I simply have a different risk assessment than most people. He studied her for another moment. Then he did something she had not expected. The pleasant expression dropped, not into hostility, but into something more honest. And what was underneath it was, in fact, concern. Real concern, unmixed with the political. He is not an easy man, Lord Aldrich said quietly. He is not a man who knows how to be easy. He has spent a very long time making himself into something that cannot be hurt, and the process has made him rigid in certain ways, demanding, though he would not frame it that way. Whatever is building between you will require things from you that nobody has the right to require. Elena looked at the Lord, at the real thing underneath the political exterior. You care about him. I have served him for 80 years, Lord Aldrich said. One develops investment. She considered him for a long moment. Then trust that I am going into this with my eyes open, she said. I'm not a girl who mistakes difficult for impossible. I know what I'm looking at. Lord Aldrich studied her. Something moved in his ancient eyes, some small recalibration of a conclusion he had arrived at before meeting her. He inclined his head, fractionally. I see, he said. He retrieved his pleasantness, settled it back over his face, and moved toward the inner corridor door. Good evening, Elena. She watched him go. Then she turned back to the anteroom, set her bucket by the door, and began to clean. Kaelin appeared an hour later. He looked at her face when he entered. That physician's assessment, quick and thorough. Aldrich spoke to you, he said. Is there anything that happens in this wing you don't know about? Very little. He moved to the table. What did he say? Elena told him, cleanly and without editorializing. Kaelin listened with his hands flat on the table, and his jaw set in that particular way that meant he was controlling something. He's not wrong, Kaelin said when she finished. Elena looked at him. I know. About all of it. I am demanding, in ways I don't always recognize in the moment. I have not practiced being close to someone. I will make mistakes that a person with more practice would not make. So will I, Elena said. He looked up. I have also not practiced this, she said simply. We're both learning something we don't have the vocabulary for yet. That seems like the same condition, not a warning. Kaelin held her gaze for a long moment. Then he crossed the room, pulled the second chair to her side of the table instead of opposite it, and sat beside her. Show me what you were reading, he said quietly. Elena pulled the botanical book from where she had left it and opened it between them, and the night moved forward, the way nights do when you are in the company of someone who makes the hours feel like something other than time passing. The thing nobody told you about proximity to something ancient, Elena was discovering, was that it changed your relationship with time. Not literally. Her days still moved in the ordinary sequence of morning and evening and the measured dark of her working hours. But the texture of time had shifted. Days that had previously blurred into each other, Monday like Tuesday like Wednesday, each one a series of tasks completed and hours ticked off toward no particular destination, now had shape, had direction. Each night had a specific quality of anticipation at its edges, a low hum underneath the work that she had not felt before. She recognized this, from the outside, as what happened to people when they were falling in love. She had watched it happen to Rosie twice, and to the girl in the room across from hers once. The particular brightening of a person, the way their attention tilted, slightly, always toward a specific gravity. She had not expected it to happen to her. She had been, for a long time, a woman who had decided that practical survival and quiet contentment were sufficient, not because she lacked capacity for feeling, but because she had not encountered anything that seemed worth the cost of feeling it. She was reconsidering this position. Kalen, for his part, was not a smooth man. This surprised her. She had expected, from everything she knew about vampire kings, a specific kind of polished and deliberate seduction, the centuries-honed art of giving people exactly what they wanted to see. What she got instead was someone who was, under all the authority and the stillness, he would go silent in the middle of conversations, following a thought she had no access to, and surface several minutes later expecting her to still be in the same place he had left her. She learned to say, simply, "Where did you go?" and wait while he found his way back. He overthought things. She noticed this in the way he sometimes chose his words, not because he was uncertain of them, but because he was running through the possible interpretations she might place on them, trying to control for misunderstanding before it happened. She had finally told him, on the 23rd night, that she would tell him when she misunderstood him, and that it was all right to speak without engineering every sentence in advance. He had looked at her as if she had said something revolutionary. "Nobody has ever told me that before," he said. "Nobody's ever offered to give you the benefit of the doubt. Not proactively," he said. "Usually people wait until I've said the wrong thing and then tell me what I should have said instead." Elena considered the specific loneliness of this, of being a person who spent every interaction 3 steps ahead of himself, managing and containing and preemptively correcting, and receiving in return not grace but corrections. "I'm offering it proactively," she said. "You can say the wrong thing. I will tell you. We will work it out." Something in his face, briefly, looked very young. On the 25th night, one of the junior lords, young by vampire standards, barely 50, with the specific overconfidence of someone who had power and not yet enough experience to make him careful about using it, stopped Elena in the main corridor, before her shift, and made the particular kind of comment that men of his specific type made to women of Elena's specific position when they believed the comment had no consequences. Elena handled it the way she had learned to handle such things. Clean, quick, no damage to herself or escalation of the situation. The specific efficiency of a woman who had spent years navigating spaces where people had more power than she did. She told Kalen about it that night because she had decided, at some point without marking the specific decision, that she was not going to manage what he knew about her life in the palace. She had not anticipated his reaction. He went very still. Not the practiced stillness she had come to associate with him, the controlled, deliberate quiet of a man managing himself. This was different. This was the stillness of something that had stopped moving, because motion required a decision about direction, and all the directions available were ones he was trying not to choose. "His name," Kalen said. "I handled it," Elena said. "I don't doubt that." His voice was very level. "His name, Kalen." He looked at her. The gray eyes, darker now, the way the sky darkens before weather. "I am going to behave appropriately," he said. "I am telling you this in advance so that you can understand that whatever is on my face right now is not an indication of what I'm going to do." A pause. His name. She held his gaze for a moment. "Lord Ferris." He nodded, once, and then the conversation moved on. He did not bring it up again that night. 2 days later, Rosie told her, with the particular tone of someone delivering information they found both significant and baffling, that Lord Ferris had been reassigned to the Eastern District. Effective immediately, by direct order. Elena absorbed this. She thought about going to him and saying something. She thought about what she would say. She went back and forth on it for 2 nights, and on the 3rd night she sat down beside him in the library and said, "The Eastern District Reassignment." Kaelin looked at his book. "That was appropriate behavior?" she said. "It was the most appropriate behavior available to me given the options," he said. "I recognize it was still significant. I am working on the calibration." Elena looked at his profile, at the jaw set slightly too tight, at the effort visible in the set of his shoulders, the effort of a man who was trying, genuinely and imperfectly, to be something different from what his instincts recommended. "The calibration is difficult," she said. "Extremely. Is it worth it, working on it?" He turned to look at her. The dark gray eyes, steady and searching and entirely without pretense. "Yes," he said, simply, without qualification. Elena held his gaze. The library held them in its ancient quiet. Outside, somewhere in the palace, a clock moved through the hour. Inside, the candles burned, and the books held their centuries of accumulated refusing to let things disappear, and the specific gravity between 2 people who were figuring out, imperfectly, how to let each other in continued its slow and irreversible work. She reached across and turned the page of his book for him. He was quiet for a moment, then, without looking up, "Thank you." "You were staring at the same page for 10 minutes, she said. "I know." "Read," she said. "I'll be here." And she was. The formal dinner happened because Lord Aldrich arranged it, and Kaelin allowed it, which Elena came to understand was its own form of communication between them. The old advisor's way of forcing situations into the open, where they could be examined and managed, and the king's way of agreeing that management was necessary, without admitting that he had been avoiding it. She was not invited as a guest. She was, technically, still the West Corridor's night shift cleaning lead. The dinner was for council members and their attached staff, and a visiting delegation from the Northern Territories who had requested an audience. Elena would not have known about it at all, except that the head steward needed additional serving staff, and her name had been added to the roster without her input. She found out 2 hours before the dinner began. She found out from Rosie, who had found out from the kitchen, who had found out from the head steward's assistant, which was the normal velocity at which information traveled. "You don't have to go," Rosie said. "I was assigned," Elena said. "You could be sick." "I'm not sick." Rosie looked at her with the particular expression of someone watching a person walk towards something and being unable to decide whether it was bravery or stubbornness. "It's going to be," she started. "Uncomfortable," Elena finished. "I know. That doesn't change anything." She had not told Kaelin. She considered this as she dressed in the formal serving uniform. Dark, neat, the kind of anonymous that serving staff were supposed to be, and concluded that telling him in advance would have produced either an attempt to remove her from the roster, which would have drawn more attention, or a conversation about whether she was all right, which she did not have time for. She was all right. She was making practical assessments and proceeding according to them. This was what practical women did. The dining hall was magnificent, in the specific way of rooms that had been designed for exactly this purpose. Every proportion calibrated to make the people at the high table look significant, and the people serving them look like furniture. Elena had been in this room once before, during a cleaning rotation 6 months ago. She had found the proportions hostile then, and found them hostile now. The council members arrived first, Lord Aldrich among them, who caught her eye as he took his seat and held it for a fraction of a second, long enough to communicate something that she read as both warning and apology. The northern delegation arrived, 12 people, 4 of whom were vampire, the rest human diplomats, in the specific formal clothing of people who were very aware of being seen. Kaelin arrived last. He walked into the room with his crown on and his full formal bearing in place, and Elena, standing near the far wall with the other serving staff, felt the shift in his awareness the moment he entered, the way he moved through the room's attention as though it were nothing, and beneath it, the way she felt him register her presence, with the specific quality of recognition that had no equivalent in ordinary language. His eyes did not find her immediately. He took his seat, spoke with Lord Aldrich, acknowledged the northern delegation with the precise, warm competence of a man who had been doing this for centuries. Then his gaze moved across the room and found her. He held it for 1 second. Then he looked away, back to his conversation, and nothing in his expression changed. The dinner began. She served. This was the work. Move quietly. Refill glasses before they emptied. Remove plates with minimum disruption. She had done this in smaller contexts during large palace events, knew the specific rhythm of it, the way you learned to be present without being noticed. The northern delegation's head of mission, a human man in his 50s, gray-bearded and direct in the way of people from colder climates, noticed her twice and thanked her both times, which was unusual enough that his companions remarked on it. Lady Seveston, one of the council members and the only woman at the high table, noticed her for different reasons. Lady Seveston was approximately 300 years old, had the specific beauty of something carved from pale stone, and possessed a social intelligence so refined it operated below the threshold of what most people could perceive. She watched Elena across the room once, and then, very briefly, looked at Kaelin, and something in the corner of her mouth did something that was not quite a smile. The difficulty came from Lord Varen. He was younger than Lord Aldrich, older than Lord Ferris, and occupied the specific space between them where confidence had solidified into habitual contempt before wisdom had softened it. He spoke loudly. He addressed the serving staff by the collective designation of "you there," and meant it to be efficient rather than unkind, which perhaps made it worse. He stopped Elena when she was carrying a tray of filled glasses toward the far end of the table. His hand on her arm was the specific kind of casual that was not accidental, the assumption of access that came from position. "You," he said. "More of the burgundy, not the pale. The pale is for the delegation." "Of course, my lord," Elena said. She adjusted the tray and turned. "Wait." He was looking at her with the expression of someone who was placing a face. "You're the one. The west corridor." The table went very slightly quieter. Not all of it. Just the section of it that was paying attention. Elena held the tray level. "I work the night shift in the West Wing. Yes." Lord Varen's expression arranged itself into something that was performing amusement while actually performing something else. "I see. And how are you finding the work? I imagine the West Wing has become considerably more interesting lately." The quiet section of the table got quieter. Lady Sevaston set her glass down. Elena looked at Lord Varen. She thought about Lord Aldrich's warning. She thought about Rosie's face. She thought about Kaelin at the far end of the table, and the 1 second of eye contact, and the controlled nothing of his expression. "The West Wing is an excellent corridor," Elena said pleasantly. "Very good light at this time of year." Lord Varen smiled, very diplomatic. He released her arm. "Do bring the burgundy." She turned and crossed the room, and she could feel, with the specific awareness that had been building in her since the night of the glass, that Kaelin had tracked every second of that exchange. She did not look at him. She retrieved the correct wine, completed her circuit of the table, and said nothing. After the dinner, after the council and the delegation, and the last of the serving staff had dispersed, she found him in the anteroom. He was standing at the window, which she had come to understand was where he went when he was working something through. "You didn't intervene," she said. "You didn't need me to." His voice was controlled. "You handled it." "I did." He turned from the window. His face held the specific quality of a man who had made a significant effort and was not entirely sure the effort had been sufficient. "Are you all right?" "Yes." She set down her tray. "Were you all right?" Watching. A long pause. His jaw worked. "No," he said honestly. "Not entirely." Elena looked at him. "But you let me handle it." "You're not mine to protect," he said. The words had the quality of something he had been repeating to himself. "You're your own. I don't have the right to." He stopped. Elena crossed the room and stood in front of him. Close enough to see the pre-dawn gray of his eyes and the effort in every line of his face. "Not yet," she said quietly. Not the way you mean, but you'll get there. Kaylin looked at her face. Something in him, very slowly, let go of something it had been holding. Yes, he said. Spring came to Varenthal the way spring always came, not as an arrival but as an accumulation, each warmer morning building on the last, until one day you looked up, and the inner courtyard had green in it, and the fountain was running again, and the specific quality of the light had shifted from the flat gray of winter into something with depth and direction. Elena noticed it through the high window of the library where, increasingly, she spent the hours between the end of her shift and the beginning of the palace's waking day. She had a corner that had become, without formal designation, hers, a chair that faced the window, a small table she had commandeered from the less used end of the room, a rotating collection of books that she worked through with the specific appetite of someone who had spent years rationing access to things she loved and was still adjusting to abundance. Kaylin was usually there too by the time she arrived. He slept less than she did, less, she had gathered, than most vampires, though she had not asked directly. He had the particular quality of night people, of those who moved most freely in the hours that the majority of the world had surrendered to unconsciousness. She would arrive in the library's pre-dawn hush and find him already there, already reading, already aware of her before she reached the door. The awareness had become mutual and comfortable. She could feel the shape of his attention without it pressing. He had learned, through the specific trial and error of a man who had not had to learn this in a very long time, to be present without being consuming. She had learned to tell him when she needed quiet and when she needed conversation, and he had learned to receive the distinction without treating it as information about how she felt about him. This was harder for him than it looked. She understood that. He processed proximity as information in a way that humans did not. Every shift in her mood, every quietness, ran the risk of being read as meaning. She had made a practice of saying what she meant directly so that he did not have to interpret. "I'm quiet because I'm thinking," she would say, "not because anything is wrong." "I know," he would say. "You were about to ask," she would say. A pause. "Yes. Now you don't have to." He had told her once, after one of these exchanges, that nobody had ever offered him that either. The preemptive information, the removal of the need to interpret. He said it like a man reporting something remarkable he had found in an unexpected place. "People usually make me work for it," he said. "The information." "That seems exhausting," Elena said. "It is," he agreed. "It is extremely exhausting." She had thought about this, about what it cost to be a person who had to interpret everything. Who could not take the easy path of just asking because asking felt like exposure, and exposure had been, for a very long time, a thing with consequences. "You can ask me things," she said, "directly. I won't use it against you." He had looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said. "I'm getting there." Spring brought other things beside green and light. It brought a second visit from the northern delegation, who had apparently been satisfied enough with the first to request an extended stay for purposes of cultural exchange. It brought the annual review of the palace staff, during which the head steward had a conversation with Elena that was notable for what it did not say. It did not comment on the irregularity of a night shift maid spending her off hours in the king's private library. It did not note the fact that Lord Ferris's reassignment had been precipitated by a conversation about her. It said, with the specific brevity of someone delivering information they had been told to deliver, her duties were being adjusted. She would retain her West Corridor assignment, but her hours were being shifted to include an afternoon administrative component in the palace records room, a role that was, the head steward noted without inflection, more appropriate to her demonstrated capabilities. Elena went back to the library that night and told Kaylin. He was looking out the window at the courtyard spring and did not turn when she entered. "Is this yours?" she said. "The adjustment was warranted, based on your demonstrated capabilities," he said, which was not an answer. "Kaylin." He turned, His face held the quality she had learned to read as the aftermath of a decision, not guilt exactly, but the awareness of having acted unilaterally in a situation where the question of his right to act was not entirely settled. "I spoke to the head steward," he said. "Yes." Elena considered him. "You could have told me first." "I could have." He held her gaze. "I should have. I acted on the instinct before I engaged the consideration. That's the calibration problem." "Yes." His jaw was tight. "I'm sorry." She looked at him for a long moment, at the effort, genuine, visible, imperfect, of a man who kept running into the edges of his own patterns and was trying, each time, to respond differently. "The role is better," she said. "I'm not unhappy about the role." "I know. I'm unhappy about the method. I know that too." She crossed the room and sat in her chair. He stayed at the window for another moment, then crossed to his own chair and sat. "Next time," she said. "Tell me first. Ask me what I want." "Yes. And I will tell you, honestly, even if what I want is not what you would choose." He looked at her steadily. "Even if what you want is to leave." The question was quiet and cost him something. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the specific effort of asking something that had a wrong answer available. "Even then," she said, "though I'm not planning to leave." "You're not?" "No." She opened her book. "I'm planning to read this entire library over the next several years and argue with you about half of it. That requires staying." The corner of his mouth moved. "Half seems generous." "I'm a generous person." She turned a page. "You'll discover this." "I'm discovering it," he said quietly. Daily. Outside, the courtyard fountain ran, and the spring light thickened toward morning, and the library held them in its centuries of collected refusal to let things disappear, and something that had been building slowly and inevitably for 37 days continued its patient, irreversible work. The night she finally asked him about the loneliness directly, it was raining. Not the dramatic rain of stories, not thunder, not lightning, not weather as metaphor, just rain, quiet and sustained, the kind that settles in for hours and makes the inside of a lit room feel like its own specific country. It ran down the high windows of the library in slow diagonals and collected in the corners of the stone sills and turned the courtyard below into a surface of moving circles. Elena had been watching it for a while, her book open but unread, when she said, "What was the hardest part of the 140 years?" Kalen looked up from his own book. "Not Marin specifically," she said. "Not any particular loss. The ongoing part. The texture of it." He was quiet for a moment. He set the book on the arm of his chair, which she had learned meant he was giving the conversation his full attention rather than partial. "The meals," he said. She had not expected this. "The meals. I don't require food the way humans do. Blood, occasionally, from sources that are managed, not intimate, never intimate, not for a long time." He looked at the rain on the window. "But I was raised in a household where meals were social, significant, the gathering, the conversation. Even in the early centuries, when I was less isolated, there was always the specific solitude of eating alone, of a table set for one because nobody had thought to ask." He paused. "It's a small thing." "It's not a small thing." "No," he agreed, "it isn't." His eyes moved to her face. "What made you ask tonight?" Elena considered being oblique and decided against it. "I was thinking about what you said once. About wanting someone to want to be here. I was thinking that wanting someone to want to be somewhere is usually about not wanting to eat alone, metaphorically." He looked at her for a long moment. "Metaphorically, or literally," she said. "I imagine both." The rain continued its quiet, patient work on the windows. Somewhere in the building below the library, the palace's nocturnal rhythms moved through their ordinary sequence. The changing of the night guard, the distant sound of the kitchen beginning its preparation for the morning staff's breakfast. "Elena," Kalen said. She looked at him. "I want to tell you something." His hands were on the arms of his chair, his posture careful in the way it was when he was choosing words with precision. "I am aware that what is between us has a trajectory, that it is moving in a direction, and I want to be honest with you about what that direction means from my side before it moves any further." She waited. "I am not a person who does things halfway," he said. "This is a quality that has served me in certain contexts and been costly in others. If I continue in this direction with you, I will not be able to do it moderately. I will not be able to maintain the kind of measured, appropriate, sensible distance that Lord Aldrich would recommend." His jaw tightened briefly. "I am telling you this because you deserve to know it in advance, because you should understand what you are moving toward." Elena held his gaze. "Are you warning me off?" "I'm warning you accurately," he said. "There's a difference." She thought about this, about Lord Aldrich's words, the demanding, the rigid, the things that couldn't be asked, about the calibration problem and the Eastern District reassignment, and the 7 years of preparation, and the specific quality of his attention in every room they shared. "I'm not a moderate person either," Elena said. "I have been, in my life, because I had to be, because the things I had access to were things that required moderation to survive, but it was never natural." He watched her face. "I want to be somewhere I don't have to moderate myself," she said. "I think you might be that. I don't know yet, but I'm not leaving to find out from a safer distance." The rain moved on the windows. The candles burned. Kalen rose from his chair, crossed the distance between them, and crouched in front of her the way he had in the corridor on the third night, down to her level, unself-conscious, close enough that she could see all the things that distance concealed. His hand rose to her face, slow, deliberate, giving her every opportunity to move away. His fingers touched her cheek. "I have been," he said quietly, "looking at every room I walked into for 140 years, and finding it empty of the thing I was looking for." His thumb traced along her cheekbone. "You are not empty." Elena placed her hand over his. "No," she said, "I'm not." He held her gaze with that gray, pre-dawn attention, and she held his, and the rain ran its quiet diagonals down the windows of the library that held centuries of things that had refused to disappear, and outside the palace continued its ordinary life, without awareness of the specific, irreversible thing that was happening inside it. He kissed her the way he did most things, with the total, unmoderated focus of a man who had decided that halfway was not available to him. And she kissed him back the way she did most things, with the specific directness of a woman who had spent a long time rationing herself and had decided, quietly and completely, to stop. They were careful. This was Kalen's doing more than hers. He understood, with the political intelligence of 8 centuries, exactly what the visibility of this would cost and what it would require, and he wanted to give her time to understand it fully before it became visible. Elena appreciated the carefulness and also found it, privately, somewhat futile. Rosie knew by the following morning, not from any specific information, but from the specific quality of Elena's face when she came off her shift, which Rosie had apparently been reading for 3 years and could distinguish in granular detail. "Finally," Rosie said, which was not the last time Elena heard that word in the following weeks. Lord Aldrich knew within 3 days. He said nothing directly. He simply stopped positioning himself in corridors where he might accidentally intercept Elena and Lord Varen in the same space, which was its own kind of information. Lady Sevaston sent her a book, no note, just a very old volume on the history of vampire-human diplomatic relations, left outside the library door with a bookmarked page. Elena read the page and found it to be a dense but clear-eyed accounting of the legal frameworks that had historically governed formal relationships between vampire nobility and human partners. She read it twice and put it on her table in the corner, and found herself returning to specific passages over the following days. Kalen found the book one evening, picked it up, read the spine, looked at her. "Sevaston," Elena said. He set it back down. "She's been on the council for 200 years, he said. "She doesn't give books to people she has written off." "I know." Elena looked at the bookmarked page. "She's trying to tell me what to expect." "What does she want you to expect?" That this has legal weight, Elena said. That if it continues in the direction it's continuing, there are formal frameworks involved, not optional ones. He was quiet for a moment. She's right. Elena looked at him. Are you telling me something? Kalen sat down. He had the quality of a man who had been thinking about something for long enough that it had worn grooves, and he was now going to say it, because not saying it was costing more than saying it. I am telling you, he said carefully, that I have no interest in a structure that has no name. That is not, I don't want something that exists only in private. His hands were flat on the table. That is not fair to you, and it is not what I want. Elena held his gaze. You're a vampire king proposing to a woman who came in here to clean your corridor. I'm a person, he said, who found the person he was looking for. After 140 years of looking, his eyes were steady on hers. The corridor is irrelevant. She looked at him for a long moment. At all of it, the 8 centuries of it, the patience and the loneliness and the calibration work and the books and the rain and his hand on her face in the library. At the man who had put a glass on a table where she would find it, because asking directly felt too much like hoping. Ask me directly, she said. A pause. He understood her immediately. She had been giving him that. The preemptive information, the removal of interpretation. He understood that she was asking him to do the thing that cost him most, the thing that had never been safe, the exposure of wanting something out loud where she could hear it. Marry me, Kalen said, not performed, not shaped for effect, just direct and quiet and completely unprotected. Choose this, choose me, let me stop walking into rooms that are empty of you. Elena looked at his face, at the pre-dawn gray of his eyes, and the specific quality of a man who has put down something very heavy and is waiting to find out if it was worth it. Yes, she said, simply, without qualification. Something in him, the last held thing, the final careful distance, released. She could see it happen, the precise moment when 8 centuries of practiced containment opened into something that was simply relief. He rose from his chair, and she rose from hers, and when he crossed the distance between them, this time, there was nothing measured about it. The wedding was not what anyone in the palace had predicted. They had expected ceremony. Varenthal had a tradition of elaborate royal weddings, weeks of preparation, delegations from neighboring territories, the specific performance of power that weddings between ruling families were designed to produce. Lord Aldrich had arrived at Kalen's study 3 days after the engagement with a folio of precedent and a list of required components that ran to 4 pages. Kalen had looked at the folio, then at Aldrich. How much of this is actually required, and how much is tradition dressed as requirement? Lord Aldrich had considered this for a moment, considerably more of the second than the first, he admitted. Then we'll do the required parts, Kalen said, and Elena will decide the rest. What Elena decided was the library. This surprised nobody who had been paying attention. The library was where they had become what they were to each other, where the books had borne witness to the slow, imperfect, irreversible work of 2 people learning each other's languages. It seemed right that it was where they would make the formal promise. They were married on a night in late spring when the courtyard below had come fully into its green, and the fountain ran, and the rain of the preceding weeks had given way to the specific, clear quality of washed air that only comes after sustained rain. The council was present because it was required. The northern delegation was present because they had asked, and it seemed, Kalen had told Elena, with the dry humor that had been emerging with increasing frequency, politic to include people who had traveled that far. Rosie was there because Elena had asked her, and Kalen had arranged it without being asked. Lady Seveston was in the front, her expression the composed neutrality of a woman watching something she had calculated correctly. Lord Aldrich stood near the back with the particular expression of someone who had worried about something for a long time, and was now discovering that the worrying had been, if not unnecessary, at least survivable. Elena wore deep green, not white. White had never suited her, which was a practical assessment. Green suited her, and she was, in the way of all practical women, unapologetically practical even here. Kalen wore his crown, because Kalen, in a wedding in his own palace, was going to wear his crown, and Elena had told him this was fine and she would be the one taking it off later, which had produced the full version of the smile that she was still, months in, delighted to discover he possessed. The vows were short. They had written them together, in the library, over 2 evenings, with significant disagreement about specific word choices that had produced the best argument they had yet had, and resolved into something better than either of them had drafted individually. Elena said, "I promise to tell you what I mean directly, and to give you the benefit of the doubt before I interpret. I promise to be here, not because I have to be, but because I have chosen it, and I will keep choosing it. I promise to read your entire library and argue with you about half of it, and to be the person in the room that you can say the wrong thing to." Kalen said, "I promise to ask before I act, and to act when you need me to. I promise to learn your preferences before assuming them, and to put down the held things when you ask me to and when you don't. I promise to set a table for 2, every night, for as long as nights exist." The last line had not been in the draft. He had added it at the moment of saying it, which she had not expected from him, and it had cost her the composure she had planned to maintain. She had let it cost her. Practical women, she had decided, were still allowed to cry at their own weddings. Afterward, in the dining hall that had been opened for the feast, Elena found herself at the center of a kind of attention she had never occupied. Not the attention of power, she understood that was Kalen's, deflected to her by proximity, something different. The attention of people who were watching something that had shifted the arrangement of the room they lived in, and were still deciding what to make of it. Lord Varon, across the table, raised a glass in her direction. His expression was not warm, but it was honest. She respected honest more than warm. Lady Sevastin appeared at her elbow at some point in the evening and said, quietly, "You were exactly what was needed, not because of the resonance, because of who you are," and then moved away before Elena had to respond, which she appreciated. Rosie cried and denied it, and then cried again and stopped denying it. Kalen, beside her at the long table, stayed close in the specific way he had when he was managing the pull toward proximity against the demands of being publicly appropriate. She took his hand under the table at some point and felt him exhale, almost silently, and settle. Later, much later, when the feast had thinned and the council had made their formal departures, and Rosie had been escorted cheerfully and tearfully back to the servants' quarters, they stood on the balcony off the library. The courtyard below was dark and green, and the fountain ran its quiet, continuous work. "What are you thinking?" Kalen said. Elena looked at the courtyard, then at him. "I'm thinking about the glass," she said. "That night, how I almost left it there." "You didn't." "I was tired," she said. "My throat was dry. I made a decision that I had absolutely no context for, and it turned out to be this." She gestured, a small motion that encompassed the courtyard and the library and the evening and him. "How do you account for that?" He looked at her steadily. "I've had 8 centuries to develop a theology on the subject," he said. "My current position is that some things have been trying to happen for a very long time, and they happen when the conditions are finally right." Elena thought about this. About a glass on a table and a dry throat, and a woman who was too practical to be afraid of the wrong things. About a man who had been setting conditions for 11 years, and then finally left the glass out. "Were you afraid?" she said. "That night, when I drank it." "Terrified," he said simply. "The first time in a very long time." "Of what?" He looked at her face. At all of it. The specific quality of someone who had become, over the past several months, the shape his attention defaulted to. The person he looked for in rooms. The voice he heard when he was reading something that needed to be shared. That it would work, he said, and then that you would leave. Elena looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached up and took the crown carefully from his head and set it on the balcony railing. "I'm not leaving," she said. Kalen looked at her, at the woman who had walked into his anteroom with a cleaning cloth and a dry throat and had not, in all the months since, once made him feel like what he was too much to be worth the effort. "I know," he said. "I'm still glad you say it." "I'll keep saying it," Elena said, "as long as it helps." "It helps," he said quietly, "every time." Below them, the fountain ran its continuous patient work in the dark. Above them, the library held its centuries of refusing to let things disappear. Between them, the space that had been, for 140 years, the specific and aching distance between a question and its answer, was finally, completely, closed. He pulled her close in the spring night air, and she let herself be pulled, and neither of them needed to say what both of them knew. Some things had been trying to happen for a very long time, and now, at last, they had.